The death of the Baron of St. Remy left more than just debts and mourning. It left Evelyn without a future, without a name, and without a choice. In a desperate act, her aunt arranges a marriage to a stranger. A man without fortune, without a past, without a face, yet whose manners clash with his supposed humility. Who is this husband who never asked to be loved, yet was forced to stay? What secrets linger within the walls of the old mansion where this story begins? Prepare to uncover a restrained passion, a buried truth, and a choice that will change everything. Tell me, from which country are you listening to this story? And you, do you believe love can be born without trust, and still withstand the test of time? Rouen, Normandy. The year was 1866. A gray sky loomed over the damp rooftops like a promise of storm. Inside the St. Remy estate, morning still clung to the corridors, though no servants remained to light candles or stoke the hearths against the cold. The death of the Baron had left more than silence in its wake. It had taken with it the honor of a name and the certainty of a future. Evelyn sat upright, her back straight and her hands tightly folded in her lap, in the very room where, once upon a time, her mother had received distinguished guests amid porcelain and embroidered tapestries. Now that same parlor smelled of mildew, old paper, and resignation. She wore a smoky gray wool dress, drawn tight by a corset that did more to constrain her breath than shape her figure. The high-necked blouse and buttoned sleeves mirrored her own state, closed, contained, forced to maintain dignity even as the world crumbled beneath her feet. Across from her, Aunt Margot spoke in a low yet unyielding voice. The woman, sharp-featured with white hair pulled into a severe bun, was meticulously reviewing the documents laid out on the worn table by the notary. Every word fell like a sentence. It's the most practical choice. There are no alternatives. He is discreet and well-mannered. No one in Rouen will know the difference. Gabriel had not yet arrived, and Evelyn didn't know whether to long for him or dread him. She had seen him only once, when Aunt Margot had received him in Father Clement's rectory. He had spoken little, dressed in a coarse wool jacket, his hair slightly tousled by the wind, and his expression so unreadable it resembled a mask. He wasn't unattractive, but he didn't seem like an ordinary man either. There was something in the way he looked, still, focused, restrained, that had unsettled her from the very first moment. He asked nothing of her, not her age, not her past, not her preferences. He had been accepted for his silence, and because he requested nothing beyond a place to live and the protection of a marital bond as a social shield. When the wall clock struck 5, the knock on the front door echoed like a funeral bell. Evelyn didn't move. It was Aunt Margot who instructed the housekeeper to let him in. Gabriel entered without hurry. He wore a clean shirt, a dark waistcoat, and a simple but well-tailored frock coat. In his hands, he held his hat with respectful composure. He bowed briefly without lowering his gaze. "Miss Evelyn," he said in a deep, perfectly measured voice. "It's an honor to formally meet you." Evelyn observed him with a mix of chill and surprise. Not because she expected a romantic gesture, she no longer believed in such things, but because there was something in his tone that did not match the modesty of his clothing. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. There was no ceremony. Only the notary's reading of the agreement's terms, the aunt's terse approval, and Evelyn's trembling signature upon the paper. Gabriel signed next without hesitation. No vows were exchanged. No promises were made. The priest recited the blessings with mechanical intonation, and the ring, a plain band of aged gold, was slipped onto her finger without emotion. There was no music, no flowers, no witnesses beyond the housekeeper and the gardener, who stood at a distance with expressions that blended compassion and unease. When the ceremony ended, Evelyn climbed the stairs to her chambers alone. There was no feast, no toast, only a cup of broth served in the kitchen, and the echo of a surname that no longer shielded anything. In her room, before the mirror stained by years, Evelyn unfastened the buttons of her dress with steady hands. There were no tears in her eyes. Only a frozen glint, like the reflection of the sky upon the Seine in winter. She thought of her father, of her childhood among books and flowers, of summers in Paris. It all seemed to belong to another woman. Downstairs, Gabriel unpacked a small valise in the adjacent room. He did not request the master bedroom. He touched nothing that was not offered. He washed his hands in cold water and sat at the table as though he had lived there always. That night, Evelyn did not sleep. She listened to the creak of the floorboards beneath his steps, to the whisper of wind at the windows, to the distant beat of a heart that refused to belong. She swore she would not love him. She swore she would not be broken. In the half-light, her silhouette resembled a statue carved from shadow. Beautiful, distant, and as solitary as a promise no one had asked for. The marriage was sealed. But her husband's face remained shrouded in mist. And in the deepest part of her soul, Evelyn felt that the true bond had only just begun, without words, without certainty, without love. Only with the weight of duty, and the quiet premonition of something yet unnamed. The carriage moved slowly along a dirt road lined with bare poplars. The wheels creaked over damp stones, and every jolt felt like a held breath inside the cabin. Evelyn gazed out the window, saying nothing. Beside her, Gabriel leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped over his knees, as if afraid to take up more space than necessary. They had exchanged no more than 3 sentences since leaving Rouen at dawn. He made no attempt at conversation. She offered none. After more than 2 hours, the carriage stopped before a wrought iron gate overgrown with dry vines. Beyond it stretched the property Gabriel had claimed as his own, an old manor house tucked away among the hills of Normandy. It was not grand like the Parisian townhouses, but its architecture spoke of better times. Gray stone walls, some veiled with moss, and window frames marked by the merciless chisel of time. Still, there was a quiet dignity about it, a kind of silent nobility that resisted decay. Gabriel stepped down from the carriage and offered his hand. Evelyn accepted it stiffly, stepping down with care to avoid soiling the hem of her navy blue dress, plain but still neat. An older servant with a stern face opened the main door with a brief bow. He asked no names, offered no welcome. Gabriel gave a subtle nod as if the man had known him forever. Evelyn noticed. Another mystery. Inside, the house smelled of aged wood, melted candle wax, and absinthe. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries, and some furniture, shrouded in white sheets, waited to be brought back to life. Yet the central hall was clean. There stood a mirror framed in dark gold, a worn carpet, and an empty vase on the console. Everything spoke of restraint, of someone trying to preserve only what was necessary without touching what hurt. "This is where we'll live," Gabriel said quietly. "There aren't many servants. The steward handles the essentials. The east wing is closed. The west wing is livable." Evelyn said nothing. She followed him, taking in each detail, each corner, each aged curtain that must once have fluttered in the fresh air. She was given a room on the upper floor, furnished in austere style. A solid wooden bed, a dresser with a mirror, and a small bookshelf filled with dusty tomes. The tall window looked out onto the back garden, where gravel paths and a crumbling greenhouse could just be seen. That evening they dined in the main hall. Gabriel poured the wine, broke the bread, and carried out each gesture with a courtesy that seemed not learned but ingrained. His posture at the table, the way he held the glass, even the manner in which he folded the napkin over his lap, all betrayed an education that did not align with the identity he claimed. Evelyn watched him from the corner of her eye, unashamedly. It wasn't the first time she'd sensed the contradiction, but here, beneath the golden glow of the chandelier, it became more pronounced. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, her voice neutral. Gabriel paused before answering. He took a sip of wine, then said, "A few years. Since I chose to leave Paris." "And what brought you to Normandy?" The question hung in the air. Gabriel lowered his gaze, but he didn't smile, nor did he appear uncomfortable. He simply replied, "Silence." Evelyn didn't press. There was something in him that resisted intrusion, not out of fear but because any added word might unravel a thread too tightly wound. In the days that followed, a monastic rhythm settled over the house. Gabriel rose at dawn, walked the grounds, oversaw minor repairs, and spent long hours in the library or the rear garden, where he patiently cleared a patch of land overrun with weeds. Evelyn watched him from the window, unable to understand how a man who claimed to have no fortune lived in an old manor, cultivated roses, and played the piano in the afternoons with a mastery only nobles from the conservatory might possess. One Sunday afternoon, the door to the music room was left ajar. Evelyn, drawn by the soft notes of a Chopin nocturne, approached quietly. Gabriel sat at the piano, back straight, fingers gliding with melancholy precision over the ivory keys. No sheet music, he played from memory. His eyes were closed and his face, usually composed, now seemed vulnerable. A man made of secrets, who allowed himself to feel only when he believed no one was watching. She backed away without a sound. She didn't want him to know she'd heard him. There was something in that music, in that suspended expression, that felt too intimate, too real. The days passed, slow, damp. Rain fell often, washing the window panes as if trying to erase traces of the past. Evelyn roamed the halls, read old books, sewed quietly by the fire. But the questions inside her grew like ivy. Who was this man sleeping under the same roof? Where had he really come from? Why did he hide so much? And why, despite it all, could she not bring herself to despise him? One afternoon as Gabriel returned from the garden, boots muddy, Evelyn dared to confront him. He stood in the threshold of the vestibule, shovel in one hand and a wilted but fragrant rose in the other. "You're not who you say you are," she said without preamble. Gabriel looked at her in silence. He didn't frown or look away. He simply observed her with that tense calm that clung to him like a second skin. "I haven't lied," he replied. "I've only remained silent." "Silence is a kind of lie too," she said, her voice slightly trembling. "No one plays like you without teachers. No one chooses wine with such precision, or walks as if the ground belongs to them." Gabriel lowered his gaze. Then, as though his words bore the weight of confession, he said, "And yet, here I am. Without title. Without fortune. Without a crest. But with secrets," she added. He took a step toward her. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. But the nearness was enough for Evelyn to feel a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold of the stone. "Don't we all have them?" he murmured. Evelyn stepped back. Not out of fear, but because this man, strange, silent, seemingly humble, was beginning to stir something deep inside her. And in that hushed house, where everything seemed asleep, something was beginning to awaken. Something she didn't yet dare to name. That night, as rain tapped the roof and the fire crackled in her chamber, Evelyn held the wilted rose Gabriel had left at her door. She held it between her fingers, unable to understand why such a simple gesture could ache so deeply. Perhaps it wasn't pain. Perhaps it was the oldest form of longing, the kind born without words, without touch, only in the invisible brush of what has not yet been spoken. Morning broke with a heavy mist over the fields of Normandy. Dew clung to the bare leaves like secrets refusing to fall. Evelyn, seated by the window in the main parlor, leafed distractedly through a leather-bound volume. Her eyes scanned the words, but her mind absorbed none of them. Her attention wandered toward the figure of Gabriel, who seemed more distant than usual that morning. He had gone out early as he always did, but his stride had been less steady, his greeting more curt. The butler handed him a letter sealed with blue wax upon his return. Evelyn saw it from the upper gallery. She watched as Gabriel stopped mid-step, stared at the envelope for a long moment, and then tucked it into the inner pocket of his frock coat without a word. The rest of the day unfolded under a tense hush. Gabriel avoided the common rooms. He did not appear at the table. He did not walk through the gardens. He was seen only briefly near dusk in the back of the house. Evelyn descended the side staircase quietly, her steps muffled by the aged carpet. From the shadowed threshold she saw him. He stood before the small iron brazier where they sometimes burned dry leaves in winter. He pulled the letter from his coat pocket, studied it for a long while as if debating with himself, and then tossed it into the fire without even breaking the seal. The flames engulfed the paper, devouring the blue wax with a gentle hiss. Gabriel didn't look away until all that remained was a charred fragment drifting into the air. Evelyn stepped back in silence. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't the letter itself but the way he had held it, with regret, with resolve, and with a shadow of fear. What kind of man burns a letter without opening it? And what could such a letter contain to warrant complete silence? That night, as Gabriel withdrew to his study, Evelyn climbed to her room with her heart racing. The sound of his footsteps through the house was nearly imperceptible, but she felt them. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his boots echoed inside her like a question without an answer. When the clock struck 11, she went down barefoot, wrapped in a woolen robe, her hair loose across her shoulders. The door to Gabriel's study wasn't fully closed. From the doorway she observed the room, stacks of books, papers meticulously arranged, an oil lamp still glowing on the desk. There was no sign of him. She entered without a sound. It wasn't curiosity that guided her, but the need to understand. On the polished surface of the desk lay a closed notebook and a small gray velvet box, barely visible among the documents. Evelyn reached out. Her fingers trembled slightly as they touched the metal clasp. She opened it. Inside rested an old oval locket, engraved with a golden crest, a symbol not belonging to any family of Normandy. She recognized it at once. She had seen it before in her father's genealogical history books. It was the emblem of the House of Belroy, one of the oldest and most esteemed in the Duchy of Ile-de-France. She opened the locket and found a miniature portrait of a woman with a serene gaze and noble bearing, whose eyes matched Gabriel's exactly. The air seemed to still. Evelyn closed the box slowly, as if the act alone might return the breath she'd lost. She left the study before he returned, but sleep would not come. The next day, upon encountering him in the corridor, she could not keep the words from spilling. "Why did you burn the letter?" she asked plainly, her voice steady. Gabriel stopped, startled. He hesitated before answering. "It wasn't important." Was it not? Or was it simply not meant to be read? Their eyes met, his calm but guarded, hers steady but wounded. Evelyn did not fear answers. She feared what was left unsaid. "Who was the woman in the locket?" she pressed, folding her arms. "She has your eyes. Your expression." Gabriel sighed. He didn't seem angry. He seemed defeated. "She was my mother." "And the crest? Was that hers too?" "Yes." Evelyn waited for more, but it never came. The answer was clear, precise, and empty. "You're not who you say you are," she murmured, stepping back. Gabriel didn't stop her. He simply lowered his gaze and gave a solemn nod, as if his silence were the only confession he could offer. That night, Evelyn did not light the candles in her room. She lay down fully dressed atop the coverlet, staring at the ceiling as the rain began to tap against the glass. The sound was steady, lulling. She drifted into sleep without realizing it. And in her dream, she wandered through endless hallways. The walls were lined with ancestral portraits, faces eerily similar, each inscribed with a name in golden plaques. One by one, the names had been crossed out. Some in ink, others in fire. She walked barefoot, searching for a way out, while the painted eyes followed her. At the end of a corridor, a door opened, and there stood Gabriel, dressed in formal attire, wrapped in shadows. He extended a hand. But as she moved toward him, his face dissolved like smoke between her fingers. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding like a drum. The candle she hadn't lit now burned faintly on the bedside table. Disoriented, she rose. As she descended the stairs, she saw the back door ajar. Stepping onto the porch, wrapped in her woolen shawl, she found the world bathed in soft, steady rain. In the garden, beneath the downpour, Gabriel stood motionless, his face turned toward the sky. In his hand, he held a wilted rose plucked from the bush he had been trying to revive. The water soaked his shirt, clinging to his frame. He didn't move. He looked like a statue carved from wet stone, rooted in grief or in memory. Evelyn said nothing. She didn't approach. She didn't want him to know she had seen. She returned to her room, her heart clenched. She didn't know what kind of life this man had lived. She didn't know why he hid so much. But she understood, suddenly, clearly, that it wasn't ambition that made him keep silent, but a wound that had never closed. And in the quiet of the night, as the rain fell and the shadows of the past moved behind the walls, Evelyn realized her husband was far more than a stranger. He was a broken man. And the things he would not say had begun to hurt her too. The morning light fell obliquely through the mansion's windows, filtering between heavy curtains and gilding the edges of the furniture, as if the house were, for a brief moment, breathing in a trace of its former splendor. Evelyn walked the corridor of the West Wing with a closed book in her hands, though her thoughts were far from its pages. The past few weeks had been marked by a subtle, almost imperceptible unrest. A tension left unnamed, drifting along the walls like an invisible current, and it wore the silent face of Gabriel. The air smelled of damp wood and melted wax. The clock struck 11 when a knock echoed against the main door. It was not a familiar sound. In that house, visitors were a rarity. Evelyn paused at the foot of the staircase and listened. The butler opened the door. A voice, unknown, masculine, and composed, introduced itself with soft authority. "Good morning. Inspector Thomas Whitmore. I've come from Paris. I have matters to discuss with Mr. Gabriel, or whoever now bears that name." Evelyn felt the breath catch in her throat. The tone was not aggressive, but it was firm. She descended slowly, restraining the impulse to run. From the upper gallery, she saw the visitor. He was a man of middle age, slender, dressed in a perfectly tailored black frock coat. He held a hat under one arm, dark gloves, and a worn leather folder beneath the other. His gaze was piercing, and when it met Evelyn's, he gave her a respectful nod, without smiling. Gabriel emerged from the salon as though he had been expecting the visit. His face betrayed no surprise, only a trace of wariness. His posture was upright, his expression calm. He greeted the inspector without warmth. "How may I assist you, monsieur?" Whitmore didn't answer right away. He looked Gabriel over, as if measuring every line of his face, every gesture, every shadow beneath his eyes. "I've been sent by recommendation of the Ministry of the Interior," he said at last. "I've been tasked with verifying certain documents, and investigating the possible reappearance of a nobleman declared dead 3 years ago, the Duke Henri de Belleroy." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. The name struck the air like a distant thunderclap. The inspector glanced at her for only a second, as if waiting for a reaction. She said nothing. She remained upright, hands clasped over her abdomen, brow slightly furrowed. Gabriel raised an eyebrow but kept his voice even. "I'm afraid I am not the man you're looking for, monsieur. My name is Gabriel, yes. But I hold no title, nor do I belong to any noble family. I was born and raised far from Paris. You're welcome to inquire in Rouen." Whitmore remained unmoved. He pulled a sheet from his folder and slowly unfolded it. Curious. The same name, approximately the same age, the same bearing, and the same eyes as the portrait we hold in the archives. Then again, portraits don't breathe. And the dead don't either. A heavy silence followed. The butler had withdrawn discreetly, but Evelyn remained unmoving. The sense that she was witnessing something not meant for her clashed with the certainty that the mask Gabriel had worn for so long was finally beginning to crack. Gabriel did not avert his gaze. He stood firm. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Inspector." Whitmore refolded the document slowly, his eyes never leaving Gabriel. "I'll return soon, perhaps with more specific questions. For now, I intend to tour the area. I won't be staying here. I've secured lodging at the village inn. But I'll be back." He offered a courteous bow, looked once more at Evelyn, and left, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. The door closed with a dull thud. Evelyn stood there for several seconds, her eyes fixed on Gabriel. "Are you going to tell me something?" she asked at last. He took a slow breath, as if weighing every word before speaking. "I can't answer questions that haven't been asked," he said calmly. "I don't need to ask them. You've already heard them," she replied, her voice barely contained. "Are you the Duke the inspector spoke of?" Gabriel lowered his gaze, and for the first time, Evelyn saw on his face a shadow of exhaustion. Not weakness, but the look of someone who has spent too long defending a secret. "I can't confirm it, nor deny it," he said quietly. "Then you are," she concluded. "No," Gabriel replied, lifting his eyes. "Not anymore." Evelyn studied him intently. There was pain in his words but also evasion. He wasn't a man who lied, he was a man who fled. "Do you think I can keep living under this roof with someone who hides the most basic truth about himself?" she asked, with a mix of fury and sorrow. "Do you think I don't have the right to know who I've married?" Gabriel stepped forward. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood before her, his expression wounded. "You have every right. But I can't give you what you ask. Not yet." "Why not?" "Because if you knew everything that happened, you might not want to look at my face again." That sentence struck her like a blade. She closed her eyes for a moment. What he said wasn't a defense, it was a silent plea. An open wound. But she too had her wounds. She had lost things. She had learned to hold back tears. "Don't mistake me, Mr. Gabriel," she said, regaining her composure. "I'm not asking you to bare your soul. But don't treat me as if I were blind. I see. And now I cannot unsee." With that, she turned and walked up the stairs with controlled steps. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply returned to her room and closed the door gently behind her, as if the order of the world depended on that small, quiet gesture. That night there was no supper. The lights were extinguished early. Gabriel went out into the garden, as he often did when the weight of the world grew heavier. The cold Normandy wind stung his face. He wore gloves and kept his coat buttoned to the neck. He walked among the dry rose bushes, the same ones he had begun to tend weeks earlier, and stopped before one. There, among the twisted branches, a single new rose had bloomed. Small, tenacious, like a promise no one had expected. He cut it gently, avoiding the thorns, and held it in his hand for a long time. Then he looked toward the house, where not a single window showed light. Upon returning, he laid the flower on the stairway ledge. He left no note. He didn't knock. He simply left that quiet gesture behind, like a sigh too timid to become words. Evelyn found it the next morning. She picked it up between her fingers, slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She placed it inside a closed book and set it on a shelf in the library, like someone tucking away something she had yet to understand. Because sometimes answers don't arrive with confessions or cries. Sometimes they hide in the smallest of things. In the brush of a flower. In the weight of a glance. In the wound of silence. The air in the mansion woke colder that morning. A subtle breeze slipped through the corridors, seeping in through the cracks of the windows, as if the house itself were breathing in its memories. Evelyn had risen early, a new unrest pulsing in her chest. Something in the way Gabriel had been avoiding her over the past few days, in the restrained silence of his every word, pushed her to seek answers. It wasn't anger that stirred within her. It was something deeper, a mix of mistrust, of dangerous attraction, and an increasing need to know who the man was with whom she shared a roof, though not a soul. Daylight had not yet fully broken when she wrapped a gray wool shawl around her shoulders, descended softly to the first floor, and made her way toward the east wing. That part of the house was always kept closed, as if it held a time to which no one should return. Gabriel never spoke of it. And though no one had ever forbidden her with words, Evelyn knew that corridor was off limits. But that morning, curiosity outweighed decorum. She gently pushed open a side door, expecting it to be locked. To her surprise, it yielded without resistance. A soft creak rose from the hinge, breaking the thick silence of the hallway. She stepped inside. The air there was different, colder, so, as if it had remained untouched for years. The curtains were drawn, but the morning light was beginning to filter through the velvet folds. The first thing she saw were the portraits, large, solemn, hung one after another along the main wall. Faces of stern-browed men, women of majestic bearing. All painted with such delicacy it made the blood run cold. And at the end, just across from a glass cabinet, one more recent portrait caught her eye. Evelyn approached slowly. It was a medium-sized oil painting, framed in dark wood. In it, a young man with dark brown hair, intense gaze, and upright posture wore formal attire of aristocratic cut. A decoration adorned his chest, and a ring rested on his right hand. Beside him sat a woman of serene beauty, her hair gathered, her expression firm yet gentle. There was no doubt, it was the same woman from the locket. And the young man was Gabriel. Without question. Evelyn's heart pounded. It was as though time had split open before her, revealing a chapter she was never meant to read. She moved to the table beneath the portrait. On it rested several leather-bound books, some with golden monograms. Beside them, a box sealed with cracked wax and a handful of aged documents. All were covered in a fine layer of dust. Nothing had been touched recently. She heard footsteps. She turned swiftly. Gabriel stood in the doorway. His face was not as usual. There was no restraint, no courtesy, none of the composed calm that usually cloaked him like armor. He looked tense. His eyes, normally tranquil, now burned with a tightly held fury that seemed to stem from something far older than that moment. "Who gave you permission to come in here?" he asked. His voice was low but filled with an emotion barely held at bay. Evelyn did not respond at once. Her head was held high, her chin steady. But her breathing was unsteady. "I don't need permission to seek the truth," she said at last. "You filled this house with shadows. You forced me to live with a lie. The least I deserve is to know who I've married." Gabriel stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He walked toward her, never breaking eye contact. "You have no idea what you're saying," he replied. "There are things that can't be understood unless they've been lived." "Then tell me," she demanded, stepping closer. "Explain them to me. Speak. Once and for all." The silence that followed was like a lightning strike. Gabriel clenched his fists. His chest rose and fell heavily. "You can't understand, Evelyn," he said through barely gritted teeth. "This isn't just about names or titles. It's about a life that was destroyed, betrayals, losses that cannot be redeemed." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. "And that gives you the right to hide? To make me a partner in your escape without even knowing it?" Gabriel's gaze faltered. Something in his expression cracked. "I never meant to drag you into this. But you did." Silence fell again. And then, without thinking, without pausing, Evelyn raised her hand and struck him. The sound of the slap was sharp. Not loud but precise. Gabriel didn't flinch. He accepted the gesture without dodging, without answering. He simply looked at her, with a mix of surprise and something deeper. Something that resembled pain but also respect. "If you don't have the courage to explain yourself, then at least have the courage to look me in the eye," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Because I can't keep living with a ghost." Gabriel stepped closer. They were so near she could feel the heat of his breath, the faint tremor in his chest. Neither of them spoke. But the tension between them was so tangible it seemed to hum in the air. It wasn't anger. It was something darker. More intimate. It was the collision of two souls facing each other without masks for the first time. Gabriel lifted a hand, not to touch her, but to hold her face with his gaze. "I never wanted you to love me," he whispered hoarsely. "I only wanted you to let me exist beside you, even if you didn't know who I was." Evelyn's eyes glistened. But she didn't cry. She didn't move. Desire lingered in the brush of their breath, in the closeness their bodies barely sustained. And for an instant, only an instant, It seemed they might take a step that could never be undone. But Evelyn stepped back. Just half a step. But it was enough to raise an invisible wall. She lowered her gaze, folded her arms, and spoke softly. "I need to think." Gabriel nodded. He didn't stop her. She left the room without looking back, closing the door gently behind her. She walked down the dim corridor, her heart still pounding wildly. She didn't know whether she feared more what she had uncovered, or what she had begun to feel. Because sometimes, the most terrifying thing is not the mystery of another person. It is the mirror that mystery places before us. And in that mirror, Evelyn was no longer merely a wife imposed by circumstance. She was a woman standing at the edge of an abyss, one she might no longer wish to step away from. By the third day without word from Gabriel, the mansion began to feel to Evelyn like a sleeping beast. Every corner seemed to hold an echo of his voice, a shadow of his footsteps, a silence that had grown heavier in his absence. No one knew where he had gone. The butler, always discreet, merely replied that Mr. Gabriel had left with instructions not to be disturbed. No letter, no message, no gesture had prepared her for that sudden solitude. Evelyn didn't ask questions. She didn't insist. But something within her, a mixture of unrest and resolve, had begun to stir with strength. It wasn't just abandonment. It was the sense of having been cornered inside a story whose threads she did not control. And she was tired of being a silent figure among walls that breathed secrets. On the fourth day, while tidying the portrait gallery, no longer a forbidden space, she discovered a forgotten wooden box on the lower shelf of a bookcase. It was covered by an embroidered cloth, golden threads dulled by time and dust. The lock was broken. There was no need to force it. She opened it. Inside lay several stacked notebooks, all bound in dark leather, their gilt edges now faded. She picked them up with care as if holding ancient bones. Upon opening the first, she found fine, precise handwriting, almost masculine, slanting slightly to the right. The entries were unsigned, but they spoke from the intimate voice of someone who knew the shadows of power all too well. She sat by the window where the light was clearer and began to read. The first pages spoke of a proud lineage, of political arrangements among noble families, of alliances sealed with marriages and territories. But as the journal progressed, its voice grew more bitter. A name appeared, Dorian Marchand, Minister of Foreign Affairs, an ambitious man who had sworn to marry off his daughter to an heir who did not love her. It also spoke of a sickly mother, of a young duke pressured to choose between duty and dignity. The dates matched what Inspector Whitmore had mentioned. One page, among almost faded lines, contained an underlined sentence. "I am not a coward for fleeing. I am guilty only of hesitating. But I will not allow my name to be tied to a vow I did not choose." Evelyn closed the journal slowly. Her breath was short. She now knew what her intuition had been whispering for some time. Gabriel was no imposter. He was an exile. A man of noble blood who had renounced his world, but not his wounds. That same day, as the sky darkened with the threat of a storm, Aunt Margot arrived without notice. The carriage rolled into the courtyard with determined pace, and the crunch of its wheels on gravel felt like another clap of thunder. Evelyn greeted her in the vestibule with the composure instilled by years of instruction. The elderly woman stepped down from the vehicle with the aid of a new cane and a black veil covering her face. "I came because I received a troubling letter," she said without preamble. "The name of this house is once again passing through the mouths of men who drag it through ministry corridors. And you, Evelyn, seem to be in the middle of a story older than yourself." They settled in the main drawing room, where the fire still burned under the butler's quiet supervision. The silence between them stretched until the aunt broke it with her steady voice. "Men with secrets, my dear, are rarely what they seem. And you, it appears, have fallen for one." Evelyn neither denied it nor confirmed it. She simply sat upright, chin lifted, hands folded over her lap. "I don't know if I'd call it love," she replied. "What I know is that I can no longer bear the darkness. Not his, not ours." Her aunt studied her for a long moment. Then she placed a small velvet-lined box on the table between them. "This ring belonged to your mother." She knew when a woman should speak, and when she should remain silent. But she also knew when to raise her head, even when everything around her began to crumble. Evelyn didn't open the box. She offered quiet thanks and helped her aunt to her room. That night, the young woman did not sleep. She reread the journals one by one. She discovered references to secret meetings, veiled threats, even the suspicious death of a royal advisor who had known too much. Gabriel's story was deeper than a simple disappearance. It was a deliberate descent into shadow to protect something, or someone. On the 5th day, the door of the mansion opened at dawn. Gabriel returned. The sound of his boots echoed through the vestibule with almost liturgical solemnity. He wore a long coat damp from the road, his hair disheveled and his beard slightly overgrown. He did not look ill nor defeated, only more tired, more alone. Evelyn met him at the foot of the staircase. She did not embrace him. She asked no questions. She looked at him with a different calm. "I've read your journals," she said softly without reproach. "And I've begun to understand." Gabriel did not respond with shock or defensiveness. He simply lowered his gaze. Then he lifted it again and found her changed. She was not broken, nor hopeful. She was more whole, more resolute. "And what have you come to understand?" Evelyn sighed. "That you did not flee out of cowardice. You fled to preserve what little was still yours. And while I do not approve of your silence, I no longer fear it." Gabriel took a step toward her. "And what happens now?" Evelyn lowered her eyes to the dried rose she had tucked days earlier between the pages of a book. She carried it now in the pocket of her dressing gown. "Now it's my turn," she replied. "But I will take no more steps in the dark. If you want my company, you will have to walk in the light, even if it hurts." Gabriel said nothing. But his face, marked by days of absence and sleepless nights, seemed to soften for the first time. In his eyes was a new spark, not of triumph but of recognition. Evelyn turned and climbed the stairs, leaving behind a man who was beginning to understand that in her, he had not only found refuge, he had found a boundary, one he could no longer cross, without showing his true face. Dusk settled over Rouen with a hush that heralded a coming storm, though the sky had yet to decide between calm and rupture. The mansion remained dim as if it sensed the arrival of an unwanted guest. In the main drawing room, the clock struck 7 just as the crunch of wheels on gravel announced the approach of a carriage. Evelyn closed the book in her hands and rose slowly. Through the window, she could make out the firm, elegant silhouette of Inspector Whitmore stepping down with assured purpose. He was dressed in black, a long coat billowing at his sides and a wide-brimmed hat shading his features. At his side stood 2 uniformed men, silent and still, holding in their hands a document, a paper that could take away what little Evelyn had begun to understand. Gabriel appeared beside her. He didn't need to look out. He already knew who had come. His face bore no fear, but there was a quiet gravity about him, like a man who has long prepared for a judgment that could no longer be delayed. He wore a simple suit, free of insignia or ornament, just a white shirt and a gray vest. And yet, standing near the unlit hearth, he looked more noble than any portrait upon the walls. The butler opened the door. Inspector Whitmore did not ask permission. He entered like a man who possessed both authority and the intent to use it. "Good evening, madam," he said upon seeing Evelyn. "Good evening, Mr. Gabriel, or should I say, Duke of Belroy." Evelyn held his gaze without blinking. Gabriel bowed his head politely but said nothing. Whitmore drew an envelope from his coat and laid it on the table. "An order signed by the ministry. The case of your disappearance has been reopened. The state requires your immediate appearance before the Council of Nobles in Paris. There are charges pending, falsifying death, abandoning public duties, and disobeying an official decree." Gabriel stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice was deep, steady, and without affectation. "I falsified nothing. I simply ceased to be who I no longer wish to be. And if the price of my conscience is punishment, I will accept it. But I will not return to Paris under accusations masked by others' agendas." The inspector gave a dry, humorless smile. "That is not your decision to make, Your Grace." It was then that Evelyn stepped forward. "This man," she said clearly, her voice calm and unraised, "is not a criminal. He has not lived by deception, nor taken advantage of a name that does not belong to him. He has worked this land with his own hands. He has honored every silence in this house. And he has tried to rebuild himself from the mud, not from marble. Can the same be said of those who now presume to judge him?" Whitmore studied her. His dark, sharp eyes showed neither mockery nor sympathy, only interest. "Madam, I do not doubt your sincerity. But it is not you who decides the Duke's fate." "No," she replied. "But I can speak to what I have seen. And what I have seen is a man alone, burdened with a guilt that was born not of cowardice, but of loyalty, to a dying mother and to a name others exploited for gain. If he must be judged, let it be with truth. But you will not drag him from here like a common criminal." The silence that followed was deep. One of the soldiers looked at the other. Gabriel turned toward Evelyn. His eyes said more than words could. Gratitude, surprise, and something that hurt more than either. Whitmore closed the envelope without reading it. "I will not use force tonight," he declared at last. "But the Duke must appear in Paris in the coming days. I cannot ignore an order signed by a minister's hand. Words may move the heart, madam, but nobility does not forget." Evelyn held her breath. Gabriel bowed his head and nodded solemnly. "I will be there," he said simply. The inspector offered a slight bow and left without another word. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The horses retreated at a steady trot down the stone path. For a moment, the mansion seemed to exhale. Evelyn did not move. Gabriel remained still before her, his face half lit by candlelight. The space between them was not wide, but it felt enormous. "You should have told me," she whispered. "Everything. From the beginning." "I tried to protect you," he answered, his voice cracking. "I didn't need protection. I needed truth." Gabriel stepped forward. He did not reach for her. He did not seek her touch. But his gaze was one of those that touches without contact. "I didn't flee out of pride. My mother was dying. And Marchand's men wanted to bind me to a marriage of convenience with his daughter. A girl without soul, without voice, another pawn in their game. My mother asked me not to accept. I faked my death. I left, burned my name, buried my rights, not out of fear, out of respect and shame. And then?" Evelyn asked, barely more than a breath. "Then I became someone else. I worked the fields. I was no one. And for the first time I felt I could breathe. Until I came here. And I saw you. And I wanted to be someone again, but at your side. Not because of my title. Not because of my past. Only because of what you awakened in me." The tears did not fall. But Evelyn's eyes filled with a quiet moisture that never broke. She walked over to the mantel and lit a candle that had begun to wane. Then, without turning to him, she said, "Then begin by staying. And by never lying to me again." Gabriel did not reply with words. He stepped forward and placed at her feet the locket he had kept for so long. He set it on the table, open. The portrait of his mother shone in the warm light. The broken wax seal still clung faintly to the edge, a silent witness to a confession finally spoken. That night, Evelyn did not sleep. She remained seated by the window, candle lit, watching the closed night beyond the glass. There was no peace in her chest. But there was clarity. And sometimes that is enough to keep breathing. The truth at last had been spoken. And though it still hurt, it hurt less than silence. Sunday dawned with a clear sky, but the air in the village carried a scent of foreboding. The rumors, once whispered behind kitchen walls and under shopfront awnings, now drifted freely through the cobbled streets. It had taken only a talkative maid glimpsing Inspector Whitmore stepping from his carriage, and a sharp-eyed boy recognizing the broken seal on a forgotten letter, for the name Belroy to spread like ink on wet parchment. By the time the church bell began to ring, no one was unaware that Mr. Gabriel was not simply a man of no lineage, but the missing Duke, and that his wife, the silent Evelyn, was nothing more than a fallen young woman who had somehow, by fortune or cunning, managed to catch him. Evelyn dressed with the same care as always. She chose a dark blue dress, unadorned, with a straight neckline and fitted sleeves. She gathered her hair into a low chignon, and draped a gray wool cloak over her shoulders. When she looked into the mirror, she did not see the humiliated girl she had once been, nor the quiet wife walking through corridors heavy with secrets. She saw what she had become, a woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to stand tall. When Gabriel entered the room, he found her seated silently by the window. "You don't have to go," he said quietly. "Oh, but I do," she replied without turning. "If I stay away, I confirm what they think. If I go, at least they'll see me on my feet." Gabriel approached her slowly. "I don't want them to hurt you," he insisted. "We can leave tonight if you wish. I know places where no one will judge you for what you haven't done." Evelyn turned to him then. Her eyes did not glisten with tears. They shone with certainty. "I don't want to leave, Gabriel," she said, speaking his name with a softness that sent a tremor through him. "I've run from who I am for too long. Today, I won't run from who I am with you." The village church was old, built of pale stone, with stained glass windows that filtered light like whispers from another world. Upon their arrival, the couple was met with thick silence. No one greeted them. No one approached. Heads turned discreetly as they passed. Eyes rose and fell like brittle leaves. Inside, Evelyn walked the central aisle with steady steps. Gabriel followed, a few paces behind, without forcing closeness. She knelt in the front pew and closed her eyes. The sermon was brief. The priest did not mention scandal or names. But the glances, the murmurs, the subtle gestures among the women said far more than words. A mother pulled her daughter away from the pew where Evelyn sat. An old man muttered loud enough for all to hear. The peasant girl who became a duchess by mistake. Evelyn opened her eyes. She didn't respond. She didn't move. But the set of her posture spoke volumes. Gabriel heard it. He stepped forward but paused, not out of fear but respect. She didn't look at him, but she knew he was there. As they exited the church, the air had turned colder. A small boy, unaware of the adult world's silent codes, approached and dropped a wildflower at her feet. His mother scolded him with a sharp tug, but Evelyn bent, picked up the flower, and tucked it into her pocket without a word. It was then that she understood. It wasn't scorn that hurt most, it was the quiet suspicion of those who couldn't bring themselves to meet her eyes. That afternoon, Gabriel pressed again. "We could leave tonight. I have contacts in Marseille. A ship. A new life. Your silence would be sacred. No one would find us." Evelyn sat by the cold hearth, her hands folded in her lap. "And would that make you happy?" she asked, not raising her voice. "I don't care about happiness if your soul is wounded." Evelyn turned toward him. Her eyes held something new, not confrontation but a steady resolve. "I didn't come to this house to hide. Or to be saved. I came not knowing who you were, and now that I do, I don't want to flee from your truth. But I won't give up mine either." Gabriel took a deep breath. He knelt before her, not to take her hands but simply to be there, as one who yields to something greater than himself. "What do you want, Evelyn?" She looked at him directly. The silence between them burned like restrained fire. "I want to stay. Here. In this house. Within these walls that now belong to me too. And I want to walk with you, not behind you. Beside you." For the first time she addressed him by his title, not with submission, but with a quiet conviction born from deep within. "Duke of Belroy," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "If you still carry that name, let us bear it with dignity. Not to remember what was lost, but to reclaim what might yet bloom." Gabriel closed his eyes. He didn't weep, but there was a new kind of peace on his face. He rose slowly, like a man returning from a long inner journey, and sat beside her. The hearth remained unlit, but the air between them was warm. That night, Evelyn wrote a letter, not to Paris nor to the minister. She wrote it to herself. A few lines left inside the book where she kept her dried flowers. "Today they looked at me as if I was worth nothing. But I didn't break. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I know who I am. And because, for the first time, so does he." The scandal didn't vanish. The judgment of society didn't fade. But Evelyn was no longer the timid girl hiding in the east wing of a stranger's home. She was a brave wife. A woman who, beneath the world's gaze, chose not to retreat. And in that choice, her true story began. Spring arrived in Red Hollow with a denser scent than usual, as if the earth, tired of keeping secrets beneath the frost, had decided to bloom all at once. The windows of the old manor were opened at dawn to let in the warm breeze, and the rose bushes, once brittle and bare, now crept along the walls with silent determination. Margaret walked through the halls with steady steps, her face serene and her gaze clear, as though each day of the past months had been preparing her for this new clarity. The house, at last, was beginning to feel like a home. It was a clear morning without mist, when the royal blue carriage bearing the crest of the crown halted before the main gate. There had been no prior notice. No letter, no emissary. Only the sound of hooves on gravel and the sight of the butler crossing the vestibule with a composed expression, announcing the arrival of a messenger from Washington. Levi descended the stairs with calm. He wore a simple but impeccable gray frock coat, and at his lapel, a dried flower pinned discreetly. He asked no questions. He simply nodded. The messenger, a young man with sharp features and precise manners, stepped down with a leather case under his arm. He bowed with polished formality and introduced himself as a courier from the Secretary of the Royal Council. "I bring official news, sir," he stated without hesitation. "The ministry has decided to close the case of Duke Levi Bradshaw of Belroy. The scandal has been overshadowed by a greater one. The conduct of Minister Thaddeus Quinn has been called into question, and the court deems it inadvisable to reopen old wounds." He extended a sealed envelope with red wax. Levi took it slowly but did not open it at once. "Must I present myself in Washington?" he asked without a trace of anxiety. "No, Your Grace," the messenger replied. "Your name, title, and rights have been formally restored. You have official permission to resume your place. Your ducal residence will be reopened at your disposal, should you wish it." Margaret, who had been standing a few steps away without speaking, held the young courier's gaze with that quiet grace only wounded women know how to sustain. The messenger greeted her respectfully before withdrawing. Levi remained silent until the door closed behind him. "It has all returned," he said softly. "Except what was lost." Margaret stepped forward. She didn't ask whether he would go. She already knew the answer. Levi opened the envelope, read the document silently, and then folded it carefully before placing it on the vestibule console. "Will you go back?" she asked without drama. He shook his head lightly. "I'd rather rebuild what I have here. With who I am now. Not with gold, but with roots." Margaret didn't reply. But something in her eyes seemed to agree beyond words. In the days that followed, the house stirred with a quiet but determined rhythm. The old gardener, now hunched and trembling, returned with his grandson to clear the paths. A round-faced woman with graying braids, who had once cooked for Levi's mother, lit the kitchen fires again. One by one the old names reappeared. The coachman, the laundress, the carpenter who remembered how the ballroom floor used to creak beneath dancing heels during winter galas. Margaret oversaw each corner with patient care. She ordered the east wing's windows to be unshuttered. The chandeliers were dusted, the vestibule clock repaired. Not in celebration of a return, but as a mark of renewal. Levi spoke little. He worked alongside the men in the gardens, pruning overgrown shrubs with his own hands, removing loose stones from the walkway, overseeing without commanding. From time to time, he paused near the gallery where Margaret read quietly in the shade of a column, and their eyes would meet in a language learned through the sharing of silences. The celebration was never announced. No invitations were printed, no musicians hired. It was more a rumor that spread through town, that the old Belroy Hall would be opened again, that candles would be lit, and the gates left ajar for anyone who wished to come. People didn't know whether it was a party, a political gesture, or a farewell. But they came. As dusk fell on the chosen day, the vestibule glowed with warm light. The chandeliers sparkled. The restored walls still bore the scars of time, and that made them all the more dignified. Women arrived in simple dresses, men in borrowed suits or those tailored to long-past sizes. There were no formal introductions, no hierarchy, only a shared sense of expectant stillness. Margaret descended the main staircase wearing a lavender muslin dress, modest and elegant, her hair swept up with antique combs and a cameo brooch at her throat. Levi awaited her below, dressed in black, the same dried flower at his lapel. He wore no medals. Only the dignity of a man who had forgiven himself. As she reached his side, he extended his hand. He said nothing, and she took it. They stepped toward the center of the hall as the music began, hesitant like an instrument waking from sleep. It wasn't an orchestra. It was a local string quartet, off-key at times, but profoundly human. Margaret and Levi danced. Not as nobles. Not as husband and wife. They danced as two souls who had found each other in ruins, and who, upon meeting, knew there would be no more masks. The townspeople watched in silence. Some smiled. Others remained still, unsure whether to applaud or hold reverent silence. No one dared to interrupt. Margaret allowed herself to close her eyes as she turned. Levi held her with strength, with tenderness. And in that moment there was no scandal, no judgment, no questions. Only rhythm, shared breath, and the echo of a love born of pain, and still standing against all odds. When the piece ended, there was a silence that felt eternal. Then a single clap. An elderly woman stood with effort and clapped once, then again and again. Soon others followed. Not an ovation. More a gesture of recognition. Levi looked at Margaret. She still held his hand, and in her eyes glowed something deeper than fleeting emotion. It was the certainty of having chosen, not the man who offered a title, but the one who dared to stay. That night, the manor did not regain its grandeur. It regained its soul. And in every corner where silence once dwelled, now bloomed small signs of what is born again, when love demands not greatness but truth. Several years had passed since that afternoon when music once again echoed through the old hall. Time, which so often wounds, became a silent ally to Levi and Margaret. It did not bring forgetfulness but growth. It did not erase scars but filled them with meaning. And in that slow, profound transformation, the manor of Belroy ceased to be a ruin and became a symbol. Each morning at dawn, Levi would cross the garden with a wooden basket on his arm and pruning shears between his fingers. His steps were steady though slower than before. His temples had turned silver and deep lines now etched his brow and mouth. Yet his bearing remained whole. There, among the rose bushes he had planted along the restored walls, He found a peace he had never known in marble halls or government offices. Every rose was different. Some wild, others carefully grafted. But all of them grew under his patient watch. And each bloom had a story. Meanwhile, in the east wing of the house, Margaret opened the shutters of the classroom she had created in what once had been a sewing room. That space, high-ceilinged with faded moldings, now held a long wooden table, mismatched benches, a chalkboard and shelves brimming with books. There, 3 times a week, she welcomed the village girls. She taught them to read aloud, to write clearly, and to tell stories with courage. She spoke of women who hadn't waited to be saved, but who stood on their own, even when they trembled. Margaret was no longer the silent girl who had signed a marriage contract with wounded pride. Nor was she merely the wife of a restored duke. She had built her own identity, not out of rebellion but out of consistency. Her name was once again spoken throughout the region, not out of scandal but out of respect. Some still whispered she was too serious. Others claimed she had tamed a nobleman. But no one, absolutely no one, could deny that the woman who walked through town with a book under her arm and her head held high deserved to be watched with admiration. One September afternoon, as the leaves began to turn gold and the wind smelled of the changing season, an official letter arrived from the capital. It was signed by a young and ambitious councilman, organizing a ceremony in the old courthouse of Red Hollow to honor noble houses that had served as instruments of national reconciliation after past scandals. The letter invited Duke Levi Bradshaw of Belroy to attend, accompanied by his wife, the Duchess Margaret Bradshaw of Belroy. It was a public recognition, a way to fully reintegrate them into the circles that had once cast them out. Levi received the letter with little interest. It was labeled as an invitation, not a summons. He left it on the drawing room desk without comment. It was Margaret who read it carefully and after a few seconds looked up. "Will you go?" she asked. Levi shrugged, offering a faint smile. "Only if you want to." She didn't answer then. But 3 days later at dusk, when the house was calm and the roses slept beneath the moonlight, Margaret entered the drawing room in a white linen dress, her hair pinned with mother-of-pearl combs and a gaze as clear as water. "We will go," she said simply. "But not to reclaim a place, to confirm the one we chose." Levi nodded. Nothing more was needed. On the day of the event, the courthouse was adorned with flags and ribbons, the chandeliers lit as they had been on gala days, and the noble names were read solemnly from a carved wooden podium. There were speeches, sweets and wine. Margaret and Levi arrived on time without escort. He wore a black tailcoat and leather gloves. She wore a cream-colored gown, simple yet majestic, with an embroidered shawl over her shoulders. When the master of ceremonies announced their name, a particular kind of silence fell. It was not rejection nor applause. It was a held breath, as though time had paused to see whether the man once called vanished and traitor would indeed walk among them again. Levi did. With steady steps, without arrogance. And beside him she walked too. The official raised his voice. "The Honorable Duchess of Belroy, Lady Margaret." But before he could finish the title, Margaret smiled softly and spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt rudely. She simply said, with a serenity that stunned and stirred all at once, "It is not the title that matters, but the name I chose to love him by." Silence. Complete and whole. No objections. No one dared respond. Because in her words there was no disdain, no rejection, no pride. Only truth. And that was enough. Levi looked at her then, as he had the first time. As when she descended the staircase of the old manor with a trembling hand and a gray dress. As when he took her hand for their first dance, when no one else had dared to applaud. He looked at her as if time had not passed. As if everything they had lived had led only to that moment, pure and luminous. They returned home before nightfall. They did not attend the banquet. They gave no interviews. When they arrived, Margaret removed her shoes at the threshold and sat on the first stone step in the garden. Levi approached with a freshly cut rose. He said nothing. He simply offered it to her. She accepted it. And after a brief silence she said, "Today I realized I don't want to be remembered as a duchess, but as the woman who chose you when no one else did." Levi knelt before her and rested his forehead on her hands. "And I want the world to know that, with or without title, you were my truest choice. In the garden where ruins had once lain, there now bloomed a love without labels, without the need for witnesses, without unnecessary ornament. A love built on solid ground, on shared silences, on glances that said enough. Because there are names we inherit, and others we choose. And Margaret chose hers with her heart held high and her dignity intact. Thus, while the world continued to turn with its codes and appearances, they remained, side by side, like the roses Levi had so lovingly cultivated. Modest on the surface, but eternal at the root. 10 springs had passed since that afternoon when music once again filled the Belroy ballroom. 10 winters had settled over the mansion's roof with their frost and silence. 10 summers had painted the fields green, and each leaf, each flower, each stone seemed to recall something of what had been lived there. Life did not stand still, but it learned to walk more slowly. The garden, once a skeleton of dry earth, had become a symphony of roses and honeysuckle. There, along gravel paths and wrought iron benches, played 2 children with dark hair and eyes that gleamed with quiet intelligence. Émile and Lucien, the children of Levi and Margaret. They wore no ornate clothing, bore no titles. They were simply children, growing up among books, music, and the living memory of a love that never needed the world's approval to justify itself. Margaret, now with silver threads woven into her braids, still taught reading in the classroom of the East Wing. But something had changed in her voice, a new sweetness born of time and certainty. The girls who once arrived shyly now returned as women, some with children of their own, others with stories to share. They called her Madame Margaret, with both respect and affection, as one names those who leave a mark without ever raising their voice. Levi no longer pruned the rose bushes with the same vigor, but he still walked the garden at dawn. He now used a walking stick of dark wood, a gift from an old servant who had returned to live nearby. His eyes retained their depth, but now held a softer warmth. He had lost weight and a light cough visited him on cold nights. But he never stopped writing. On his oak desk were piles of notebooks filled with reflections, letters with no recipients, and fragments of a memory he had chosen to preserve, not for the history books but for those who might one day ask, who was the Duke of Belroy truly? Society had changed, slowly like the seasons. The scandal of Minister Marchand had been sealed in official archives as a minor incident, but his fall served as a warning to others. No one challenged Levi's name again, nor questioned the legitimacy of his choice. Some nobles called him eccentric, others wise, but all understood there was no power greater than that of a man who knows himself. Aunt Elise never quite recovered after that visit to Red Hollow. She died 3 years later, in silence, surrounded by letters never sent. Margaret attended the funeral in a gray dress, with a bouquet of violets in her hand. She did not weep publicly. But that night, on the gallery, she spent hours gazing at the sky, like someone saying goodbye to what was never said aloud. Her relationship with her aunt had always been tense, but both knew deep down they resembled each other more than either dared admit. Inspector Whitmore was transferred to another province. The last letter he sent arrived at the mansion with a white rose tucked inside. It offered no apology, only a single line written in a steady hand, "Some truths come late, but they come." Levi read it aloud and tucked it between the pages of the journal Margaret had gifted him that first winter together. And so the years passed, in simplicity, in daily rituals, in afternoon teas under the linden trees and birthdays marked with almond cake and piano music. The grand celebration of life, they had come to understand, was not found in Parisian ballrooms or formal receptions. It was in the brush of hands, in the nighttime laughter of their children, in the letters Margaret helped the village girls write. One autumn afternoon, as the wind swept dry leaves down the main path, Margaret stopped beside a marble bust Levi had placed in the garden. It was not of himself nor of her. It was of his mother, Duchess Clara, whose face had once been uncovered in a long-lost portrait. Beneath the bust, an inscription read, "Truth is not inherited, it is earned." Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She felt, as she did every day, the living presence of all they had built. And in that moment, with a deep peace, she understood that their story had not been told for books, but for hearts. For in a time when women were silenced and men measured by their titles, she had chosen to see beyond. She had chosen to love a stranger. Chosen to stay when everything said she should run. Chosen to build not an empire, but a home. And there, in the gardens where ruins had once lain, something now bloomed that the world had never understood, but that they had defended with quiet strength. A love that had defeated time, pride, and forgetfulness. And that, even 10 years later, still breathed in every rose that opened at dawn. There are stories that are not merely read, they are felt. The story of Margaret and Levi reminds us that true love doesn't always come wrapped in promises or bearing a noble name. It is born in silence, strengthened in doubt, and blossoms when we choose to stay, even when we had every reason to leave. This is a story of courage, of dignity reclaimed, of choosing with the heart in a world that so often demands decisions of reason. Margaret did not simply find a husband, she found her voice. And Levi did not just reclaim his name, he reclaimed the possibility of loving without hiding. If this story touched your heart, if a scene stirred your soul, if a phrase echoed within you, share your thoughts in the comments. What moved you most? And if you made it this far, write the word roots in the comments. That way I'll know you're one of those who truly feel these stories, and who journey with us to the very last breath of each tale. Don't forget to explore the other stories I've left linked for you. Each one is crafted with the same love, to make you feel part of this universe of emotion, memory, and hope. Thank you for staying. I'll see you in the next story, where the heart once again will find its way home.